My name's Chella. More officially, it's Dr. Marchella Ward, but that's far too long for anybody to remember. You'll see from your program that I was, until very recently, the archivist researcher at the APGRD, the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama, an even longer title, in Oxford. I've actually just last week changed my job. I'm now the Tinsley Outreach Fellow at Worcester College, Oxford. But either way, my research remains the same. My research is on the long history of Greek drama, more usually Greek tragedy, but occasionally Greek comedy. I'm interested in the ways that ancient drama evolves as it moves forward through history. So I'm interested in why we still watch Greek plays today, essentially. So I'm going to talk a little bit about issues of staging Aristophanic comedy. So Amazon Prime Video recently did a poll of the top 10 funniest films, and they measured them in laughs per minute of their users. So their users had to declare how many times in the film they had laughed, and then that was divided by the number of minutes in the film, and then the metric became sort of the top 10 films by laughs per minute of Amazon Prime users. Some of the results were total classics. Monty Python's Life of Brian was on the list. Others were slightly newer releases. I think Superbad was on there, Borat was on there, Bridesmaids was on there. All sorts of nonsense featured in the top 10. Laughs per minute is obviously a kind of interesting measure of comic value, partly because it's incredibly hard to predict. And in fact, when the film streaming service users were asked to say what their favorite comic film is, The Life of Brian comes top, but it doesn't come top on the laughs per minute list. So there's something there about how we think things are funny and how much we actually laugh at them. There's a differential going on. It relies not on our cognitive or intellectual interaction with what's going on the screen in front of us, but on a kind of gut reaction. Or, to put the problem a different way, we're very good at knowing in theory what we ought to find funny, but that isn't always the same as what makes us laugh. And think for a minute about films that you've seen yourself recently and the moments that you laughed at. Do you know why? Do you know what made that reaction happen in your body in response to what you'd seen? Sure, comedy sometimes can perform a series of political, intellectual, real-world functions, right? You can laugh at political satire, and simultaneously you can be made aware that you ought to be less likely to vote for Trump, for instance. Comedy can do that. You can use humor to imagine a world where the powerless are more powerful, and in imagining that world, you might be kind of invited to undermine the structures of power that we live by. So comedy can do real-world things. It can cause kind of real-world change. But we also laugh for a whole host of less highbrow reasons, right? Somebody falls over, slips on a banana, wears a silly hat, or adopts a silly walk. These are all more performative things that might make us laugh. Does anybody have an example of something that they've watched in a film or in a play and they found funny recently? No comedy fans in the room? No one has seen a single comedy. A very sad state of affairs, yeah.
Yes, Minister, and just the way Sir Humphrey pours out words, posh words that very few people can understand, purely to be confusing.
Yeah, and that's an interesting example, right? Because it's not always to do with what those words mean. It's the way they're performed. It's the way that they come out. It's the fact that they're incongruous with other things that are going on. So that's what I'm sort of trying to set up, is that we, as people who are interested in ancient comedy, we sort of overanalyze comedy. We look to the words, because the words are all we've got, to tell us something about why these things were funny. But really, we know that in our own lives, in our own culture, all sorts of things make us laugh that have nothing to do with what we might think. We're, on the whole, very bad at talking about why we find the things we find funny, funny. Anyone who goes to the theatre with any kind of regularity will have experienced what I like to call the awkward laugh, when audiences laugh quite simply because they have no idea what else they should be doing. Either something that's very kind of rude or very inappropriate has just happened. Audiences often laugh at that, even when what's happened is not funny at all. Actually, it's quite uncomfortable. And something that comic actors constantly remind us of is the fact that they rarely know how an audience will react to a particular joke from one night to the next. So comedy is situational. It's something that is evoked differently with different audiences. It's part of a community. We're even worse at talking about ancient comedy than we are about modern comedy. And in part, that's because we know so little about it and about how it was staged. What we call old comedy is for us as modern readers and audience members restricted to the comedies of very few playwrights, right? We think about a single playwright, Aristophanes, although we know that Aristophanes is one of around 60 poets writing plays like him, and that the genre itself is much, much older than the single poet example that we have of it. There are quite simply thousands of fragments of ancient comedy, enough to indicate that more than 800 plays were performed in the 5th century in this particular genre. So this was a genre that's hugely popular and made up a huge textual output in this period, but it's a genre that we have access to only the tiniest percentage of. And for me, as somebody who's interested in classical reception and in the long history of classics, that's a really exciting thing, because what we're dealing with is the way that we imagine ancient comedy, much more than what ancient comedy actually was. We know very little about what ancient comedy actually was like. It's up to us as modern readers to imagine that. And that means important things about the text and the genre of ancient comedy. It means that we're necessarily wrong about how we understand comedy as a genre, right? It must be more varied than we are able to imagine based on the small percentage of output that we have access to. There was simply just so much more of it that we know nothing about. But it also means important things for what we think that comedy might have looked like, or in other words, its staging. And that's what I'm going to focus on for what remains of my time. We have two main sources for what ancient comedies look like: the texts themselves, obviously, and pottery, ancient pots. And I'm not an expert on ancient pots. I hold my hands up and say that my use of pots is purely to mine them for theatrical images. I'm like that person in the bookshop that only goes to the one shelf every single time. And when it comes to thinking about the texts, we need to issue various caveats, right? No drama exists as a text alone. There's no such thing as an ancient reader for performance texts, at least not until late antiquity. And most people in ancient Greece experienced these plays by watching them in the theatre, or, crucially, seeing the images of them painted on vases and as part of various kinds of artwork. Drama is a visual form, and that's something that we too often forget when we study these plays as texts, and we isolate them completely from either their performances or their other visual contexts. Or, as you're about to see today, we also isolate them from a modern performance context. It isn't common to perform Aristophanes. You're going to see something really quite special, much more special than watching tragedy, which you can do every other year at the National Theatre if you want to. We absolutely need to take comedy seriously as a visual medium, and we're very lucky that we have a number of scenes of comic actors painted on vases from the 5th century. But what we can't do is simply trust that those vase painters have accurately represented what they saw in front of them. How many times, after all, do you hear that an artist has simply painted an accurate representation of what they saw in front of them? That's not on the whole how artists work, and we shouldn't imagine that it's how ancient artists work either. There's a vase, which I think is on here, yeah, from around 45 BCE that's a really famous example of this. What is this? Can someone describe this vase to me? What's happening? What do you see? I'm not asking for a difficult answer. Don't think too hard about it. Just tell me what you see up there. Birds. Yeah, okay, there's two birds. And there's some kind of strange figure in the middle. What's he doing, this strange figure? Yeah, he's playing the flute, exactly. He's playing some kind of pipes. So there are different opinions about what we're actually seeing on this vase. People will say, oh, is it a cockfight that's going on? There seems to be some kind of, some argument going on between these two birds here. Scholars in the past have interpreted this as the chorus of a play by Aristophanes called The Birds. So it has a chorus made up of birds, as the title indicates. A lot of Aristophanes does what he says on the tin. You'll get used to that fairly quickly. Except that it can't be the chorus from Aristophanes' Birds, because in the play, Tereus, who's one of the characters, tells us precisely each species of bird that is present, and cocks like these don't appear in that list. So there's a kind of, we can interpret this as those birds if we want to, but the text is sort of fighting us on that interpretation. So what do we do with an artifact that looks initially like it might be evidence for a particular performance, but doesn't conform to something that's made very explicit in the text? Or to put the question a different way, who should we believe? What the poets say that we're going to see, or what an artist says that he saw? Where do you want to kind of position yourself within that conversation? And this is a conversation that has to be had over and over and over again when you study any kind of ancient performance. We can never construct what actually happened, at least until we invent some kind of time machine that can take us back to 405 BC and watch the play win and then ask people what they saw as they watched it. All we can do is use a variety of different kinds of evidence to establish the boundaries of what is possible. The text helps us to an extent, and the visual record, images like this might help us a little bit more, but there are inconsistencies, and we're always trying to guess what the relationship might have been between different kinds of evidence, and struggling with what to do when we meet a contradiction like this. So all of this by way of warning not to take too many bits of evidence at face value. We may only have a small percentage of text for comedy, but we're quite a lot more successful, relatively speaking, when it comes to the text of ancient tragedy. And this explains why scholars on the whole have been more interested in working on the performance of ancient tragedy than they have on ancient comedy. There's a kind of interesting fragment by a writer called Aristophanes that makes a comparison between comedy and tragedy, showing us that modern scholars are not at all the first ones to compare one to the other in order to try and understand the two genres. You don't have to read the whole thing, but essentially what Aristophanes says is that tragic poets have it much easier than comic poets because spectators know the plots of tragic plays already. So before the characters even open their mouths, they know what's going to happen. He says you just have to say the name Oedipus and the spectators know all the rest. Comic authors, on the other hand, that's the bit at the bottom here, have to make everything up from scratch. They have a much harder job, he says. And there's no they don't have a traditional story to go on. So this impulse to kind of compare comedy and tragedy like this goes back a long way, and it does have some basis in ancient staging practices. It seems, at least from the evidence we have, that comedies and tragedies were often, at least initially, not always, performed at the same festivals and even sometimes in the same theatre buildings as tragedies. So there's something about the staging practices here that invites us to make comparisons. As you get sort of later in the history of comedy, that's not true. And even at the beginning, there are exceptions. There are separate festivals. But like tragedies, comedies are a competitive medium. They're performed, as part of a competition. And this, just like it did for tragedy, meant that playwrights were often engaged in that game of trying to put a new spin on something in order to be impressive and to win a prize. Although the two groups of actors would have been totally separate, so there's one group for comedy and a completely different group for tragedy, they have a kind of shared space and a kind of shared competitive context that allows us to imagine what comedies would have been like using what we know about tragedies, which is, comparatively speaking, quite a lot more. And as you'll see when you watch The Frogs, comedy is a genre that is absolutely obsessed with tragedy. It cannot forget it. It cannot give it up. In The Frogs, as you've already been told, and as you'll see later on, we see tragic playwrights arguing about what makes good tragedy, whose plays are better. So comedy is a genre that has something to say about tragedy. It's not just that it shares various aspects of its staging with tragedy. It has a lot to say about what tragedy is. Both use masks, both use music, both are very political, although in different ways political. But from the texts of comedies, we can see beyond this very kind of simplistic comparison with tragedy. Even in the very few extant plays that we have of comedy, there are choruses of frogs, of wasps, of birds. I mean, these are the kinds of things that would never, ever appear in a tragedy. So on the one hand, they have a lot in common, but also comedy has this kind of extravagance. It has these kind of fanciful roles that have no place at all in tragedy, where, even gods in tragedy are nearly always in human form, and the closest we come to kind of real animals on stage in tragedy is goddesses who snuffle along the ground like dogs do. So you don't get that kind of animalistic, otherworldly, kind of totally not logical thing that you get in comedy. Comedy is full of special effects, flying scenes, boats, freak weather conditions. You get all of that in ancient comedy. Its production values are hugely elaborate in a way that those of tragedy aren't, or not at least in the same way. And we see this both demanded by the scenes in the text and also reflected in artifacts that depict comic plots and characters. There are far fewer rules in comedy, so things don't necessarily have to follow logically from one thing to the next. And it seems, as you'll see when you watch The Frogs, that introducing songs and dances just for the sake of it is in comedy a perfectly acceptable thing to do. They're singing and dancing in tragedy too, of course, but in tragedy it's much more kind of stylized. It follows certain important things that happen. Certain types of action in tragedy are followed by certain kinds of song, which kind of have certain kinds of movement attached to them. In comedy, it's much more free form. There's one particular kind of evidence for the possibilities of ancient performance and ancient stagings of Aristophanes that we haven't at all considered. And it's the one that's brought all of you here today, and that's modern performance. Most of these pictures, by the way, are from the Cambridge Greek play production of The Frogs. What's the point, you might ask, of performing an ancient play that is so full of political humor that's specific to its own time and takes several scholars, years and years of study of the language and use of multiple books and concordances and that kind of thing to be able to read it? What's the point in staging that? Who do these plays appeal to and why? We learn something very important about ancient comedy when we perform it. Modern directors have to work out ways to make new audiences laugh at old jokes, and that's a very difficult thing to do, because they're not just old jokes, but they're old jokes that have often lost their relevance completely. They've been taken completely out of their context. We as an audience no longer necessarily have any idea who the statesman is who's being kind of lampooned in the play. So they have to be updated and they have to be shifted to an entirely different context. Take, for instance, the opening lines of The Frogs. We begin The Frogs with a conversation between the god Dionysus and the slave Xanthias, and that's the two of them there. That's Xanthias carrying all of the stuff, and that's Dionysus with his head in the box. And it's a conversation that revolves around various in-jokes, right? This is it on the left here. So Xanthias, this is the very first few lines of the play. Xanthias says, "Master, shall I tell one of those usual jokes that always make the audience laugh?" Dionysus says, "Oh, by Zeus, you say whatever you want, except I'm hard-pressed. Forget that one, it's really quite annoying." "Nothing else witty either," says Xanthias. "Anything but what a strain." "What then? Can I say a really funny one?" "Of course, go right ahead, but don't let me catch you saying this." "What's that?" "That you must shift your pack to ease yourself." "Well, can't I say I've got such a load on me, unless someone takes it off, I'll bust a gut?" "Please don't, unless you wish to make me sick," says Dionysus. So there's a problem here, isn't there, which is that in-jokes don't carry very well over several centuries. We don't know what these jokes are. We don't know what joke Xanthias is threatening to tell that he's being told not to tell. The situation is quite clear, and in a sense, some parts of the joke are obvious. Xanthias is the put-upon slave, so there's some kind of social commentary there in the slave pushing back the boundaries in a conversation with a god. There's some kind of obvious innuendo to Xanthias's phrases. I think bust a gut is probably a fart joke, of which there are very, very many in Greek comedy, as you will learn. But the jokes that Xanthias threatens to tell here, the same way that, I don't know, your uncle at your Christmas dinner might threaten to tell a really old, boring knock-knock joke or something, those jokes mean nothing to us as modern audiences because we simply don't know them. And this is part of the problem of being modern readers of ancient comedy, that comedy is created for and by a particular community. But it's also a problem for directors who want to stage Aristophanes. They use pantomime, and pantomime is a really useful analog for ancient comedy here because pantomime is where we get those kinds of theatrical jokes that we see over and over and over again. So pantomime is kind of one of the places in modern theatre. There are a number of places, actually, but pantomime is one of the places in modern theatre where we find those kinds of repeated jokes, those kinds of very stylized jokes. So that was great. I thought that was brilliant. Thank you. Good. Great. Well, we're very lucky that between 405 BCE and now, we're not the only directors to have tried to make this work. In fact, Aristophanes' Frogs is one of the most commonly staged comedies. And when I say that, I say it with a bit of a caveat, because when I say commonly staged comedies, I said at the beginning the comedies on the whole are much less commonly staged in the modern world than the tragedies. Tragedies at the moment seem to be having this huge moment of renewal, but comedies are sort of lagging behind. They've never really had that. They've always been thought of as historically specific pieces. They've always been thought of as something that really could only work in their own times. But the Frogs, of all the comedies, the Frogs seems to have had one of the largest performance histories. And I've just put some images up there of various. This one is from the National Opera in Greece. And this is one of the earliest Cambridge Greek plays there. But what works and what doesn't in the staging of Aristophanes will always rely to an extent on our understanding of past and present. And I just wanted to show you this just as a kind of final few minutes, because this is a scene again from the Cambridge Greek play. And the Cambridge Greek play is a kind of interesting, it's a very, very old tradition, but it's a kind of interesting tradition because what they do is every 3 years they put on they put on a Greek play. It's recently been a tragedy and a comedy together. And they do that in Greek, but they do it in a totally modern staging. And this was the Frogs, and you can see lots of green things. They had a fantastic chorus of frogs, actually, who aren't on this picture. But there's something interesting here about how they have tried to sort of update this politically, isn't there? Does anybody see a specific attempt to make this modern here? What do you see? Who's this? That's interesting. I think this play has dated because it was a couple of years ago and it was Boris Johnson, but now that's interesting to me that you all say Trump. But yeah, when they made this play, they put a whole host of, they made it function as modern political commentary by turning the characters into a whole host of modern political figures, including in this case Boris Johnson. So there was a kind of active attempt to update the political material, and that's something that is particularly difficult in the staging of Aristophanic comedy, is what do you do about the fact that the politics are so specific? You know, I know that you heard Michael just now talk a little bit about the history of this play and the kind of the political context of this play. And you will now go into watching Aristophanes' Frogs understanding that. So you'll be able to, if you want to, try and imagine yourselves in the mindset of somebody watching in 405, or as Michael said, in 404, you can make that decision, but that's not knowledge that other audiences have necessarily had access to. So one of the jobs for directors is to say, well, to what extent do we want this to stay a piece that is noticeably about ancient concerns, or to what extent do we want to update it and try and give it relevance? So you'll be able to look today and see whether you can see that kind of work going on. See whether you can see moments where they've made a decision that this should be something that remains Greek, that remains ancient, that remains, in some senses, less approachable, perhaps for some of us. Or they want to bring it into to the modern day. They want to give it a modern political relevance. Maybe a modern political relevance that is in some way in dialogue with the ancient political situation. That's something that happens too. So you'll be able to look out for that process of making the play modern. As for how we stage comedy, one of the interesting things for someone with a job like mine who's interested in the long history of ancient plays is that there will always be new resonances. If you perform the same thing in different years, they mean different things. They don't stay the same. The ill-fitting suit and the blonde wig wouldn't have been funny until it reminded us of Boris Johnson. You've all just reminded me that that resonance has already changed. This already looks like somebody else. And, you know, no doubt there was an ancient equivalent to Boris Johnson who it looked like in 4 or 5 BCE too. And as for whether tonight's staging of Aristophanic comedy will be one that you can measure in laughs per minute, I don't know, and I'll have to leave it to tonight's performers to help us find that out. But we, I hope, are now in a position of being able to look at this play and think about it as a process of adaptation, not just think about it as a historical artifact. Think of it as something that has grown and changed, and from which we all will take away a slightly different meaning, because the resonances of that ancient play will mean something different to each of us.